All right, get ready to dive into some pretty deep waters today. We're talking about the unity of consciousness. That feeling of experiencing everything as one whole thing, not like a jumble of sights or sounds or thoughts.
It's a concept that, well, philosophers have been trying to wrap their heads around for ages. Even figuring out how to define it can be a challenge. But let's try to at least get a handle on what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, for sure. So when we use this phrase, unity of consciousness, what are we actually talking about in a practical sense?
Hmm. Think of it this way. When you bite into, let's say, an apple, you don't experience the taste, then the smell, then the texture as separate things.
Yeah,
It's one complete experience all at the same time.
you got it. It all comes together. So how have philosophers over the years, how have they tried to grapple with this idea of unity?
Well, one example, Descartes, he used the fact that conscious experience can't be divided up, that indivisible nature, as an argument for his mind-body dualism. Essentially, he said that if the mind can't be broken down into parts, then it can't be made of matter, because matter, to him, has to have parts.
Ah, classic Descartes. Always separating the mind and the body. But were other philosophers on board with that?
Not exactly. I mean, Kant, for instance, he agreed with the idea that consciousness has this unifying quality, but he didn't think it necessarily meant that the mind wasn't material. He was more interested in what this unity reveals about how the mind actually works.
That's interesting. So even when philosophers agreed on this unity thing, they still had different interpretations. Were there any who just straight up rejected the whole idea of a unified consciousness?
Oh, absolutely. Hume, for example, was pretty skeptical. He suggested that what we perceive as unity might actually be an illusion, like a trick our minds are playing on us.
So our experience might feel unified, but deep down it's actually fragmented. That's kind of a wild thought. Is there any evidence to back up this skepticism?
There is. There's this fascinating phenomenon called change blindness that sort of sheds some light on how limited our awareness really is. Experiments have shown that people often miss pretty big changes happening right in front of them.
Oh, right, like that experiment where they switch out one person for another in the middle of a conversation and the observer doesn't even notice.
Exactly. It suggests that we're conscious of way less than we think we are. Now, this doesn't automatically mean unity is wrong, but it does make you wonder about just how far our conscious awareness actually extends.
Okay, so how much unity we have, that's up for debate. But let's say, for argument's sake, that this unity thing is real. Can it ever be disrupted? Can it be broken? Now that's where things get really interesting. Taking a look at those cases where unity seems to go a little haywire can give us some really valuable clues about the nature of consciousness.
All right, lay some mind-blowing examples on me. What happens when this unity goes off the rails? One of the most well-known examples has to do with split brain patients. These are people who have had the connection between the two halves of their brain surgically severed.
Oh yeah, I've heard of them. Don't they sometimes act as if they have two separate minds?
That's right. In controlled experiments, they can exhibit some, well, pretty strange behavior. Imagine showing a split brain patient the word taxable, but it's split so that tax is processed by one hemisphere and able by the other. One hand might actually write tax while the other writes ably, almost as if two minds are at work independently.
Whoa, that's incredible. But does that really mean they have two completely distinct minds? Or could there be another interpretation?
There is. Some researchers have proposed what's called the switch model. They argue that there's still just one mind, but it's rapidly switching back and forth between the two hemispheres, like it's focusing on one at a time.
So not a split in consciousness, but more of a rapid toggling between different parts of the brain.
Exactly. Think of it as a mental juggling act. It keeps the experiences flowing even though they're coming from these separate sources.
Okay, split brain patients. Show us what happens when the communication breaks down between those hemispheres. What other examples are there of this disrupted unity?
Well, have you ever heard of mirror twins? These are identical twins whose bodies are mirrored, and sometimes their behavior, it suggests something pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I think I have. I've heard stories of them doing things in perfect sync as if they're sharing a single mind.
Exactly. There's this famous case of the Chaplin twins, Greta and Frida. They would always dress identically and finish each other's sentences. They even did tasks together with this like uncanny synchronicity. And they absolutely hated being apart. They complained of feeling incomplete when they were separated.
Wow. That almost sounds like a single consciousness that's stretching across two bodies. Definitely makes you think about our usual idea of what individual unity is. Are there cases where instead of expanding or splitting, unity seems to shrink?
There are. Conditions like hemi-neglect and anosognosia really show how conscious awareness can become strangely limited.
Hemi-neglect, that's the one where people ignore half of their body or their visual field, right?
You got it. Imagine experiencing only one side of your world as if the other half just doesn't exist. And then there's anosognosia, where people are totally unaware of their disabilities, even really severe ones. They could be paralyzed, but insist they can move their limbs.
That's both fascinating and kind of terrifying. But it seems like in these cases, the range of unity is messed with, but not necessarily broken.
Yeah, you're right. It's like the container of consciousness changes shape, but the feeling of a unified experience is still there. But there are other conditions like schizophrenia, dysexecutive syndrome, and simultagnosia, where the unity itself seems to kind of shatter.
Okay, let's break that down. How does schizophrenia, for example, affect the unity of consciousness?
Well, in severe cases, it can lead to a real fragmentation of conscious awareness. Think of it like a mirror that's been shattered. Each piece reflects just a distorted part of reality. People with schizophrenia may have a really hard time connecting their thoughts and actions, even taking care of basic needs. They can experience the world as utterly chaotic and disjointed.
That sounds incredibly distressing.
Uh,
What about dysexecutive syndrome? How does that work?
Individuals with this condition, they struggle to hold even two things in their mind at the same time. Their ability to focus, to plan, to do even simple tasks is seriously impaired. It's like their awareness is narrowed down to a tiny pinpoint, making it almost impossible to experience the world as a whole.
Wow, that's a stark contrast to what we saw with those mirror twins. And simultagnosia, what about that?
Simultagnosia is a pretty rare disorder where people can only perceive one object at a time. Imagine looking at a room full of furniture, but you only see one chair, then one table, then one lamp, one after the other. You never really see the whole scene.
So their visual world is like constantly shifting, never letting them grasp their surroundings as a unified whole.
Exactly. It's another powerful example of how messing with unity can have a huge impact on our ability to interact with the world.
So far, we've defined unity, explored how it's been interpreted historically, and looked at some fascinating cases where it breaks down. But I'm curious, are there any theories out there that try to explain how unity actually works in the first place?
Oh, there are. And they're just as intriguing and challenging as the concept itself. We'll dive into those next. Remember those two main views we talked about on how unified experience is structured? The experiential parts view and the no experiential parts view.
Yeah, the jigsaw puzzle versus the panoramic photo. How do those ideas fit into theories about how unity works?
Well, they form the basis for some of the main theories. The EP view, the one with the separate experiences combining, it has to explain how those parts come together without just becoming a jumbled mess.
Yeah, I can see the problem. Just having a bunch of separate experiences doesn't make them a unified whole. It's like, I don't know, having all the ingredients for a cake but not knowing how to bake it.
Exactly. People who support the EP view often focus on how the individual parts are related, like connections in space or time, to try and explain how they become a unified experience. But then it gets trickier when you think about abstract thoughts or emotions. Those aren't as easily linked in space or time.
So the EP view has to find a way to unify things that goes beyond simple spatial or temporal connections. What about the NEP view? How does it handle unity if there aren't separate parts to combine?
The NEP view kind of neatly sidesteps that whole issue. It suggests that experiences don't really get combined, they get fused, like they're replaced by a new, more complex experience that encompasses all the earlier stuff.
So instead of a puzzle, it's more like those individual experiences sort of melt away and a new unified experience pops up.
Right. Like baking a cake, you start with separate ingredients, but once they're all mixed and baked, you don't have separate ingredients anymore. You have a delicious, fully integrated whole.
That's a tasty analogy. But are those the only theories out there trying to explain unity?
Not at all. There are plenty more, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Another really interesting idea is the internal links theory. This one says that to have unified experiences, their content has to be linked in some way, whether it's spatial relationships, causal connections, or even conceptual associations.
So kind of similar to the EP view, but with a bigger emphasis on how the parts relate to each other. Didn't Kant like this kind of idea?
He did. Kant believed that for us to experience things as unified, they need to be conceptually linked.
But what about cases where unity seems to be there even when there aren't any obvious links? Like the bent stick illusion, where a stick looks bent in water even though we know it's straight.
You're right, the internal links theory definitely has some challenges. It's hard for it to explain all the ways our conscious experience can be unified.
So internal links might not be the whole story. What other theories are there?
Another fascinating one is the co-ownership theory. This one focuses on the subject of the experience. It argues that for experiences to be unified, they need to all belong to the same self, the same owner of those experiences.
So it's not about what the experiences are, it's about who's having them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea is that the self acts like this unifying force, binding all those experiences together into one coherent whole.
But is just owning all those experiences enough? What if they're still totally disconnected from each other?
That's a great question. And it gets at a key debate around the co-ownership theory. Is it enough for experiences to belong to the same self, or do they need something more, some kind of extra connection or integration?
It feels like we need more than just ownership to really explain how rich and interconnected our conscious experience is.
You're right. And that's exactly why philosophers are still wrestling with these questions, trying to find a theory that truly captures the mystery of unity.
It's like a philosophical detective story. We've got all these clues, but we haven't quite cracked the case yet. But speaking of searching, I'm curious about the physical side of things. What do we know about how our brain actually creates this unified experience?
Ah, that's where philosophy meets neuroscience. There are lots of theories about what are called the neural correlates of consciousness, or NCCs for short. They try to figure out which brain regions and processes are responsible for consciousness.
And CCs. That sounds complicated.
It is complicated, but it's also super exciting. Researchers are using all kinds of really cutting-edge techniques like brain scans, neural networks, even AI to try and understand this stuff.
Are there any specific areas in the brain that seem especially important for unity?
Some researchers think the prefrontal cortex is key. It's really important for planning and making decisions and working memory, so it could be this central hub that integrates different parts of conscious experience.
That makes sense. It's like the brain's executive control center, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Exactly. Others focus on the thalamus, which is this relay station deep in the brain. It receives sensory information and sends it off to the cortex. Some think the thalamus might act as a global workspace for consciousness, bringing together all these different streams of information into a unified whole.
So many possibilities. But with all these different theories about NCCs, it seems like we don't have a definitive answer yet.
That's true. The brain is incredibly complex, and consciousness is one of its biggest mysteries. But the more we learn about the brain, the closer we get to understanding the secrets of unity.
Okay, I am officially in awe of the brain. But before we get too lost in the neural weeds, let's zoom back out to the bigger picture. We've talked about unity at one point in time, but what about unity across time? How does our experience flow from moment to moment without feeling like a bunch of separate snapshots?
That's another crucial piece of unity, the continuity of consciousness. It brings up some fascinating questions about memory, personal identity, and the very nature of self over time.
That's a big one.
hmm
How does unity tie into who we are as individuals over time?
Well, the philosopher John Locke, he argued that being the same person over time really comes down to having the same consciousness. It's that continuous flow of experience connected by memory that makes us who we are.
So, if our memories are what link us to our past selves, does that mean if we lose our memories, we lose ourselves?
That's a question that's been puzzling philosophers for ages. It gets into some really thorny issues about the nature of the self and whether it's even possible to exist without a sense of your own history. But before we go too far down that existential rabbit hole, let's look at some other mind-bending philosophical puzzles that are connected to unity.
Okay, hit me with those brain-twisting puzzles.
One particularly tricky one comes from those split brain cases we were talking about. It's what the philosopher Thomas Nagel called the no whole number problem.
No whole number problem. That sounds ominous.
It is. Nagel argued that in split brain patients, it's not a simple matter of one mind or two minds. It's this weird in-between state where unity seems to be both present and absent at the same time.
So it's not as straightforward as split brain, therefore split mind.
Nope, not at all. The relationship between the physical brain and the subjective experience of unity is way more complicated than that.
All right, I'm starting to see why this whole unity thing is such a philosophical head-scratcher. Any other puzzles we should try to untangle?
Well, there's the question of what's called partial unity, which is just as confusing as it sounds. Could it be that experience A is unified with experience B, and B is unified with C, but A is not unified with C?
Wait, what? How is that even possible?
It's a crazy idea, but there's actually some intriguing research that suggests it might happen. Colwyn Treverthen, a developmental psychologist, found some strange cases where an object seemed to just vanish from a split brain patient's consciousness when they reached for it with their left hand.
Vanish from consciousness, like a magic trick.
Almost. It suggests that the intention to act, which is itself a conscious experience, can somehow disrupt the unity of other conscious experiences.
That is seriously bizarre. Does that mean unity isn't some absolute all-or-nothing thing? Maybe it's more fluid and dynamic than we usually think?
That's a real possibility. The more we learn about unity of consciousness, the more mysterious it seems to get.
We've been talking about this idea of unity across time and how our experiences flow from one moment to the next. But it makes me think about memory. Is it just about remembering past experiences, or is there something more to it?
It's definitely more nuanced than just simple recollection. The philosopher Edmund Husserl, he talked about the difference between actually experiencing something over time and just remembering it later. It's not just about storing memories, it's about how those memories become part of our ongoing, stream of consciousness. And this continuous flow, it's crucial for things like language, for music, even for our sense of self.
So it's like those past experiences aren't just tucked away somewhere. They're woven into our present awareness. Which makes me think about personal identity. How does this unity across time connect to who we are as individuals?
Well, John Locke, a philosopher who is really into personal identity, argued that being the same person over time basically comes down to having the same consciousness. It's that continuous flow of conscious experience, all linked together by memory, that makes us who we are.
That makes a lot of sense. But then it raises a question that's always kind of bugged me. If our memories are what connect us to our past selves, what happens if we lose those memories? Does that mean we've lost ourselves?
That's a classic philosophical head scratcher. It really forces us to think about what the self even is and whether we can exist without a sense of our own personal history. We may not have clear-cut answers, but even wrestling with those questions can give us some pretty profound insights.
It definitely reminds us how intricate and interconnected our minds really are. But before we get too deep into those philosophical depths, are there any other, mind-bending puzzles related to unity that we should try to unpack?
Of course. Remember those split brain cases we talked about? They actually lead to what philosopher Thomas Nagel called the no whole number problem. He said these cases can't be easily categorized as having one mind or two minds. They're kind of stuck in this weird in-between state.
So it's not as simple as split brain, split mind.
Not at all. The connection between our physical brain and the subjective experience of unity is much more complex than that.
Every time we peel back a layer, it seems like there's even more complexity underneath. Are there any other puzzles we can explore?
There's the question of what's called partial unity. Could it be that experience A is unified with B, and B is unified with C, but A isn't unified with C?
Whoa, now that's a mind-boggling concept. How could that even work?
I know, it seems impossible, right? But some research suggests it might actually be a thing. Colwyn Treverthen, a developmental psychologist, did some studies with split brain patients and found some pretty strange cases. Like an object would seem to disappear from the patient's consciousness when they reached for it with their left hand.
Objects just vanishing from their awareness? Sounds like something out of a magic show.
It does, doesn't it? This research hints that even the intention to act, which is a conscious experience in itself, could potentially disrupt the unity of other conscious experiences.
So the more we learn about the unity of consciousness, the more questions we seem to have. It's been a wild ride exploring all of this.
It really has, and it highlights just how fundamental this idea of unity is to understanding the human mind. It's not some abstract philosophical idea. It affects our thoughts, our emotions, our actions, even how we see the world.
Absolutely. We may not have all the answers, but even asking these questions, it helps us understand ourselves and the universe a little bit better.
You got it. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from our deep dive today. The process of exploring, challenging our assumptions, and being okay with the mystery is just as important as finding those concrete answers.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, keep those philosophical gears turning. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the unity of consciousness.